I want to talk about the apologetics in the context of science. And so what this course is all about is helping you address apologetic questions involving the sciences in your own context. So the motivation for this is that as a Christian apologist, you may need to respond to claims such as the following: that science contradicts the Bible, Christians must either believe the Bible or believe science, science proves that the Quran is true, or that psychology shows that belief in God is a figment of your imagination. So to respond to these kind of claims, an apologist should first do two things. And one is to clarify what is an appropriate way to relate science and theology in their own contexts. And secondly, to understand how their audience might think about the relationship between science and theology, or between science and Christianity. So, this is an outline of what we'll discuss. First of all, we need to think about, well, how do we define theology? And how do we define the sciences? Now, because that can be controversial and divisive, I want to do something that may seem a little strange at first, and then just take a simple, non-controversial question, such as, what is a tree? Now, we'll see that there's actually multiple perspectives on what a tree is, and this multiple perspectives depend on the context. And so then we'll move on to discussing what is science, what is theology, and then how you might relate theology and the sciences in your own context. And I should stress, this is just the beginning of the discussion, but I want to somehow expose you to some of the complexities of these kind of discussions. So let's go to the tree. What is a tree? Well, some people would say a tree is a plant that lives for more than 2 years and has an elongated stem, a trunk, supporting branches and leaves. Or you could say a tree is a part of a forest. A tree is a source of carbon dioxide and nutrients. A tree is something that gives you shade from the sun. Or a tree is a source of timber to build things. But there's different definitions coming from different perspectives. And you might ask, well, which is the correct definition? Well, all the things I said before are actually true, but in particular and relevant and important in particular contexts. But this is the question we have to ask: are all definitions and perspectives equally valid? And are some more useful than others? And who gets to decide? Me? You? Your non-Christian friend? The government? The church? So here's another perspective on what a tree is. Now, in Hinduism, a tree is the resting place for Krishna, is said to be the leaf of the banyan tree. And so in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna said, there is a banyan tree which has its roots upward and its branches down, and the Vedic hymns are its leaves. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. And so we see pictures here of people making a pilgrimage to such a banyan tree. So that's another perspective on what a tree is. Now, what about in the Bible? Well, there's trees in the Bible, and they present different images. So again, the tree is not just a biological system, something which has branches and leaves and lives for more than a year. It can actually be a symbol of something, and particularly a powerful symbol. For we look in Genesis, and the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now in Proverbs it says, wisdom is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold fast to her will be blessed. And then the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and the one who is wise saves lives. And then in Jeremiah, the Lord called Israel a thriving olive tree with beautiful fruit in form. But with the roar of a mighty storm, he will set the tree on fire and its branches will be broken. And so trees can be viewed from many different perspectives: biological, genetic, ecological, historical, from forestry, social, economic, mythological, and biblical perspectives. Now, the value of the answers depends on the context, but not all the perspectives are valid or useful. We would contest some of these from the ancient African context or the ancient Indian context. Some of those views of what a tree is, we might debate. And here's another one where someone, you can find this on the internet, someone who claims to be a scientist says trees can feel pain and they have emotion, such as fear. They like to stand close to each other and cuddle. Trees adore company and like to take things slow. Now, you might say that doesn't make sense, particularly from a scientific point of view, because trees do not have a brain or a nervous system. So is that a useful perspective? Is that a valid perspective? And so what's the point of this discussion? Might seem a little tedious even, but it illustrates that even defining something as simple as a tree is not easy. And there are many different perspectives, but we can't say that just one perspective is right. We can't say just the biblical perspective is right or the biological perspective is right, because what matters is whether a specific perspective is useful in a specific context. But again, not all perspectives are necessarily true. Now, similar issues arise when we just try and define science and define what theology are. Because before we can have a dialogue between theology and science, we need to define what they actually are. And that is not so easy. Now, theology can be defined from many perspectives, from a doctrinal, historical, cultural, intellectual, philosophical, biblical, or sociological perspective. And who gets to decide what perspective is the most useful, what's the most valid? And science can also be defined from many perspectives. With respect to a specific discipline, from the point of view of, say, physics or biology or psychology, And it can be designed from a logical perspective, a historical, sociological, philosophical, methodological. And are all the sciences, when we think of natural, biological, social science, are they really all the same thing? Is there just one thing that's called science? And again, who gets to decide how the science should be defined? The scientists, the politicians, the general public, the theologians. And so we come to this theology. Now, you can encounter different perspectives about what theology is. Some people will say it's a set of propositions about God. Others will say it's an academic discipline in elite universities and seminaries. Some would say it's just any discussion about God. Everyone has a theology, even atheists have a theology. Or you can have a historical perspective on what theology is and look how it's changed and developed over the ages and look at different creeds and traditions. Atheists might say theology is a fiction. It's just a set of superstitions, or it's irrational beliefs held without evidence. And some would say, well, theology is just what the Bible says about God. And there are many different forms of theology. There's systematic theology, narrative theology, and then within different traditions, Catholic, Reformed, Protestant, Evangelical, Pentecostal, they all have a theology. And then there are contextual theologies, such as Dalit in India, African theology, feminist theology, and liberation theology. And some might say that actually the Reformed or Catholic theology is contextual. And then there's biblical theology, which is in the sense of it's trying to look at the whole Bible and develop a theology based on that. But that still has elements of being contextual and systematic. So there are subtleties here, and again, the question is, who gets to decide what the best definition is, and which are the valid perspectives? Now, with science, similarly, it's hard to define and contest it. Some people would say, well, it's what you read in science textbooks. Science is a body of knowledge about the material world. Others would focus on it being a method, saying, and this is something I've said, a fairly systematic method to obtain reliable knowledge about the material world. Others would say science is the only valid source of truth. That's what science is. Others would say it's an instrument of oppression, colonialism, and environmental destruction. Some would say science is atheism. It's believing there is no God. Sociologists might say science is whatever scientists do and believe, and that's largely a social construction. So then the question is, even if we accept a particular perspective, how are we going to relate theology and the sciences? Are they different? Are they similar? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What are the tensions? But just to back up, to see how complicated that is, we might ask, what's the relationship between humans and trees? And again, there can be many different perspectives. We could look at this question just from a biological point of view. Trees don't have, what are the differences? Trees don't have brains. They don't, have a nervous system. On the other hand, they have cells, they have DNA, proteins. They consume oxygen, produce carbon dioxide. But they could look at them genetically and look at how the DNA in the tree, what are the similarities and differences from the DNA in a human? Or an economic perspective, environmental perspective, or this mythological perspective. And a historical perspective, how have humans and trees been related over the hundreds and even thousands of years? Or we could have a theological perspective. We can see how again, from the Bible, that there's a clear relationship between humans and trees and how humans view trees and what they're an image of. So, how might theology and the sciences be related? Well, again, it depends what perspective we're coming from, and it depends on our context. And so different perspectives may be useful in a particular context, but not in another. But I just mentioned, and this will be discussed later, about how if you look at the literature about theology and science, or science and religion, one of the models that gets discussed a lot is that the idea that there's actually 4 models for relating science and religion. And one is conflict, that the two are basically in conflict. They contradict one another. And so they're fighting for the same ground. One may be right or one may be wrong. Another is that they're independent of one another, that they really have nothing to do with each other. They're answering different questions, and that they use different methods, and they're really concerned with totally different things. So we shouldn't really bother about trying to relate them. Another is the idea of fusion, that there's really one sort of truth, and so they must, to be true, they both have to be brought in together and made consistent with one another. So we need to modify one or the other, or both, to bring them to be the same. Another is that they're complementary and that they can dialogue, that they may be answering different questions from different perspectives, but we can bring them into discussion. So if you're going to discuss a dialogue between theology and the sciences in your context, things to be clear about is what is science and what is theology, and then how are they related or not related. Now, possible answers could come from multiple perspectives, not from every perspective, but there may be different ways of looking at these questions. And not all of the perspectives are going to be useful or valid, in a particular context. And that's some of what you're going to have to work out. So I'll look forward to more discussions as we go into some of these things in more detail.